soki medali vala umlomo ngikaze ngikushiye dali wami belukulu iqiniso kimi awiqiniso kimi dale dali wami belukulu iqiniso kimi dale dali wami belukulu iqiniso kimi dale dale wami aleqaleni mozokhuluma nami wehlisa izwi moya phansi ayikhanda lakho wena kuduma inkani lalela izintombi ziningi yeke uziqedwe mfana abantu vele uyeke yavuka ngiyaphanda mina ngisebenza ngizunethezekile wena weyibodombolo thina sikhwele sikuthwele.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone from wherever you're joining us today, and an absolute warm welcome to today's digital dialogue. Really appreciate you joining us. This digital dialogue is brought to you by the International Civil Society Centre in partnership with the Civic Tech Innovation Network. And before we get started, before we do any formal introductions, we've just got a few points of housekeeping. I'm seeing the room fill up as we go, so hopefully people will join us as we go. But I'll start off for now with our housekeeping, and Daria, our colleague in tech, will also share in the chat in case anyone has missed some of our briefing in terms of that. So we really would love to have as full participation as possible. To facilitate that, one aspect is that if you could please use the hide non-participant function so that only speakers are visible on your screen at any given point. This just allows for much easier access for everyone joining. We'll also share the instructions in the chat in case you've missed them. So the tag or the function button is hide non-participant, hide non-video participants. If you have any tech issues, any sound issues, I suppose, please do send a direct message to Daria. You'll see Daria is labeled Daria Tech in the Zoom chat, and Daria will be sure to assist you. Throughout the session, please feel free to get involved, to participate. You don't have to wait until the question and answer session to share your session questions or any observations. Please make use of the chat to point out anything you'd like to in today's call, and we'll be sure to collate them and share them with our speakers and make sure that that contributes to our conversation. So please feel free to do that. In terms of our social media engagement, feel free to post, tweet, or X as you wish about the dialogue. Our hashtag is #digitaldialogues. And as you do so, please tag your colleagues, but in particular, if you could tag at ICS_center, at ICS_center, and at Civic Tech Africa, the two organizations co-hosting our session today. So please do launch into conversation throughout the session. We'd really appreciate that. Our session today will be recorded, and the link will be sent after the session to all participants who registered. I also think if you've got colleagues who forgot to register, who forgot to join, you're most welcome to share that with them too, so they can join future sessions if they missed out on today. Right. So to kick off our session today, I'm going to do a brief introduction of myself, a self-description, and I'm going to ask as well that as our speakers come on a little bit later, that they do the same. I am a Black African woman with a round face and dreadlocks. Today, I am wearing spectacles and a pink shirt and a blue and white striped dress. We'll ask our panelists to do the same later as self-description to ensure that we're as inclusive as possible in terms of any participants and colleagues who have visual impairments. So the Digital Dialogues is a series of panel discussions that explore civil society perspectives on the emerging issues within the digital world. I'm especially excited about our theme today, which is framed Digital Democracy, Deepening Social Justice, or Introducing New Gatekeeping. So really looking at the pros and cons in a sense, and interrogating some of the elements of what we define as digital democracy, but I'll kind of listen back to that. Throughout the world, we're seeing that digital technologies are having an increasingly significant influence on how citizens interact with governance systems, with public institutions, and democratic processes. The concept of digital democracy, interestingly for me, for sure, which I didn't know, emerged as far back as the 1990s. Decades later, the concept retains something of an amorphous use, useful, but in some respects quite amorphous. From civic engagement platforms and election monitoring tools, digital innovation is transforming the landscape of democracy and public participation around the globe. Despite that, the growth in internet connectivity and adoption of mobile technology, there are still significant digital divides that remain along the lines of geography, lines of gender, income, and education. So these realities raise really important questions about the role of digital democracy initiatives on the continent, the African continent in particular, which is an interest of some of our work, but more globally. So while digital platforms have the potential to amplify marginalized voices and broaden civic participation, they may also unintentionally reproduce existing inequalities and perhaps new inequalities and new injustices. So this particular space requires us to reflect on how digital democracy initiatives can be designed to genuinely deepen social justice and inclusion rather than reinforce existing or new inequalities. So enough from me. I'm especially excited to have our session today guided by a really excellent panel. People always say their panels are excellent, but this panel is excellent, I promise you. In no particular order, we have Chibuzo Nwabeze, who is a program and network coordinator at Civicus. We have Isidua Oribabo, who is business and human rights manager at Access Now. And we have Daniel Makisak, who's the founder of Celestial Commons, all of whom have a particularly interesting perspective on the subject today, and each of whom have an interesting background that I think will really inform this discussion in a particularly unique way. So the more detailed bios, if you want to learn more about our speakers, will be dropped in the chat. So Daria will share that in the chat just so you can hear more, listen more, and of course reach out to any of them. I'm sure they'd be most welcoming of that. Okay. So let's kick our session off today. And again, just a reminder, as we go into part one of our session, that each of our speakers, as I call them up, to be sure that they introduce themselves to their personal descriptors. To kick us off today, we have Chibuzo, as I've mentioned. Chibuzo, if you could please join me on the screen, open your video and turn on your audio. And if you could just share with us your opening remarks today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you. My name is Nwabeze Chibuzo. I'm a Black male from Nigeria. I have a black hair, black skin, and I'm putting on a blue shirt. I'm not very great with colors, but I think it's a blue shirt there. Yes, and I'll be serving as one of the panelists on this conversation today, and I'm happy to be here. And to get started, I think maybe just to mention that I think there is no doubt around the fact that digital democracy portends, or rather digital solutions and digital technology portends, a whole lot of value for democracy, for civic space, for social justice work globally. I think this has been adequately established. The moderator, also outlined this when she mentioned the history sort of digital technologies inroad into democracy work globally. So, on a foundational level, I think this is a fact that that most of us, would agree to. But in sort of maximizing the value that comes with the value that digital technology and digital solutions, bring into democracy, civics work, civic space, and social justice work. We need to sort of address certain fundamental gaps and what I like to describe as associated issues that if left unchecked, if left unaddressed, we might sort of be replicating harm and possibly, eliminating traditional gatekeepers and introducing new forms of gatekeepers, into the democratic space. And some of these issues, the issues, gaps, and associated as what I call associated issues, focus mainly, for me around 6 to 7 major gaps. First is around how we address access and digital divide, especially, in the global majority where we have issues around poor infrastructure, limiting the ability of citizens, to maximally utilize digital solutions and digital technology in democratic participation. I think we also need to address the issues around platform ownership, digital oligarchy. Recently, we finalized a study on digital oligarchy and the influence on democratic and political processes globally, especially in the global majority. The report is currently being finalized and would be released soon. We need to look at issues around who really designs the technology that we use, who controls it, who decides who participates and who is excluded, who decides what sort of content, makes it into the mainstream view, and the whole sort of issues in the what I like to refer to as the algorithmic power conversation value chain, right? There are issues, of course, that we must talk about and address around data safety, data management, data colonialism, and most recently, issues around surveillance, using the data that have been captured from citizens' usage of digital technology and digital solution. There is also the issue around how participation and access can guarantee influence, influencing political processes, influencing democratic outcomes, and not just participation for the sake of participation. And then, of course, there is the issue around the governance and regulation of digital space, of digital platforms, what constitutes adequate regulation, and what determines or constitutes overregulation, who should be involved in the regulation and governance frameworks, whether it's the involvement of citizens, of civil society groups, the involvement of multilateral institutions, regional bodies, governments, the private sector is sufficient, what sort of participatory frameworks for governance and regulation, needs to be established, who should lead this process, what level of participation and frameworks for participation should be established, in terms of platform governance and regulation, or the governance and regulation of digital spaces. These issues need to be adequately addressed for us to be able to obtain maximum value, from digital technology, digital solutions, civic technology, technology, depending on how you want to look at it, the subsets in its contribution to advancing democracy, civic space, and social justice work globally. A failure to have these conversations, address these associated issues, including those that are currently existing and those that would come up in the future, as the digital sphere continues to evolve, especially also with the introduction of AI, would mean that we might have created a new system, a new digital framework or a new system broadly, that reintroduces the challenges and the gaps and the issues that around democracy and civic space that we were trying to address initially using digital technology and digital solutions. Thank you.
Just in time. Thank you. Thank you, Chibuzo. Yeah, thank you for that. And please, just a reminder to our participants to feel free to share your questions in the chat as we go. I'm going to welcome now Itudua to join me on the screen and to share your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Zuki. I'll begin quickly with a self-description. So I am a Black Nigerian-American woman with short dark hair, wearing a pink sweater today as well. I guess Zuki and I coordinated. But to begin, I'll just give a little bit of a background of where I work before sharing some reflections on the idea of digital democracy. I lead the business and human rights work at Access Now, which is an international NGO that is focused on extending and defending the rights of those at risk. So we work at the intersection of technology and human rights, looking at the impacts that technology has on individuals, on communities, on democratic processes, and the roles that both states and the private sector have in ensuring that people's rights are respected. So when I think of this idea of digital democracy, for me, the first thing that comes to mind, particularly with my background and work, is the role of the private sector. It's not really possible for us to talk about technology and the impacts that it has on society without talking about the companies that provide us access to the internet, that provide us the tools that we use while we're online, the platforms that we browse, and increasingly have sway over the way that we participate even in daily life, much less in democracy. I'd say, at the genesis and the growth of the private sector, there were many things that were not foreseen about the extent to which these companies' tools would have an impact on our lives. Coming down later down the years to find things like the way that social media platforms have played a role in conflicts around the world, from Southeast Asia to Africa and in the US and Europe. So increasingly, it's becoming clear that technology is not in and of itself neutral, not in the way that it's made and not in the way that it's being deployed. And when we talk about digital democracy, this is all the more important because we're talking about fundamental rights of the way that we as citizens of where we are can participate in society. Within the last few years, the growth of generative AI and other forms of emergent technology has pushed this conversation even further, right? Thinking about how will democracy look different when we have generative AI tools that have changed things on a scale and speed that we really haven't seen. Back in 2024, which was called the year of democracy, as there were more than 60 elections happening around the world. That was a big concern, right? The questions of, with this intersection of generative AI, the rise of these emergent technologies, what impact will it have on the elections that were taking place? And what we saw from that, I think, is really illustrative of the issue with the sector as a whole, which is that while there were impacts on certain forms and elections in different ways, a lot of the fundamental issues that happened in the age of AI are things that happened even before. So we're still talking about the fundamental issues of access to information, of mis and disinformation, of the propagation of hate speech, and other forms of content online. So I guess the crux of my points today is that when we think about digital democracy, we really need to think about the companies that we're allowing to have a say in how we have access to exercise our rights to participate in society. by and large, we're talking about these massive multinational companies that are generally based here in the US, where I am, in Silicon Valley, that are having an impact on people around the world. And all too often, we see these companies creating tools that are meant for one context and applying them to a different context without fully taking into account the nuances in language and culture and other things that can impact the way that a technology is being used and deployed. So a lot of the work is trying to ensure that companies are really undergoing a robust human rights due diligence process to understand the way that their tools are going to be used, knowing that now more than ever, those tools are being used in contexts that they didn't imagine. And the two final points I'll make, one is on conflict. As I mentioned a bit earlier, increasingly we're seeing the role that technology plays in conflict. Not just in the way that we talk about conflict, right, of how social media companies might restrict or moderate content around specific sensitive conflicts and wars and areas, but also we're seeing these companies that have been tech companies for a long time increasingly becoming providers of tools that are used as weapons. So we're seeing more contracts between private companies and governments to provide AI tools and other tools that are used as targeting systems to identify targets in the military context. So all of this really pushes forward this idea that we urgently need to address the role of the private sector when we talk about conflict. And the final point I'll make here is just that, there are areas where governments, in some cases, fail to meet their responsibility to uphold the rights of their citizens. And in some cases, we see the companies come in to fill in those gaps. And while it is important for us to have, other means of accountability through the private sector, it's also important that we need to hold them accountable to ensure that we're not ceding over power that should belong to states and to government to a private sector, which we know fundamentally is using our data and the powers that they receive for profits reasons. So I'll stop there, but really looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thanks for that, Isidro. I mean, just based on our first two panelists' input, I already wish I was a participant based on all the questions I've got brimming in my head. Right. Next, I'd like to welcome Daniel to please join me on the platform or on the podium. Daniel, over to you. Please put on your video and audio.
Hi, thanks so much. Really, really grateful to be here. My name is Daniel McKissick. The self-description, I'm a mostly bald white guy from New Zealand with Scots-Irish ancestry. I'm wearing brown-rimmed glasses. I've got a poorly trimmed ginger beard, and I'm wearing a pale sweater with a bit of a zip at the top. So just a bit of background. I've been operating somewhere between democracy and technology for the last sort of 10 to 15 years. I was a researcher during the Arab Spring, focusing on mapping trust networks through democratic revolutions. I've founded a platform for journalists and media organizations that to address distrust and disinformation through process transparency. And I have basically spent the last sort of 5 to 8 years somewhere between product development and consulting and more acutely in the DemTech space, looking at these issues. One of the biggest sort of thing that has always been important to me and really stuck with me since those early days as a researcher is the social fabric of democracy, right? Like the foundational stuff that really allows the rest to happen. So often conceptions of democracy rest on institutional and legal framework systems and processes and leave out human connection. And how that is functioning, how people are actually relating to each other and trusting each other. So that's always been really, really important to me. And I've always viewed it as a critical part of the equation, something that constitutes, I would say, sustainable democracy and not just democracy in general. And that's obviously a big challenge today. So my fellow speakers have already covered so much of the structural issues so I should say structural challenges, because they're not all issues. Structural challenges that face digital democracy and implementation of democratic processes online. And not just online, but also with things like e-voting machines and stuff like that. So I thought I'd touch on a couple of other points. I guess one of them would be a structural issue, another would be an implementation issue, and then also something that makes me a little bit optimistic. So the structural issue that the contextual, actually, I'd say it's more of a contextual issue, and that is for lack of a better term, the sort of like parasocial displacement that happens in online communities, in the social fabric within which democratic processes operate, and we've already seen it over the last 10 to 20 years with social media, everything from Facebook to YouTube, where the traditional trust networks that tended largely to be in person, or at least a lot closer proximity, a lot greater in-person familiarity, have been subverted by people and networks and individuals, corporations, governments, and so forth, like far outside those networks. And in a lot of cases, I mean, I think we can all say optimistically, back in the day, we all thought the internet was going to bring the world closer together, but we can see in practical terms that has been a mechanism for subverting the sort of social fabric of democracy, and we've seen a lot of the outcomes of that. And now with AI, that problem, I'd say, risks being exacerbated. It is being exacerbated by another order of magnitude, because our social trust networks can be influenced and subverted by non-human actors, right? At scale, at volume, large volumes of them, and that is already happening, and we're seeing like the implications of that, the effects of that, I should say. The implementation issue that I'd flag up that really touches on what the other speakers were talking about as well is that digital democracy or democratic practices online can often, not always, but can often, particularly in an environment where we're already experiencing various forms of democratic decline, can be used almost as a sort of an anesthetic. And that the reasons for doing it. I mean, in the participation space, it's often said that, like, initiative and will needs to emerge from government bodies and from like decision makers. I think there's obvious reasons for that, because that's how the other end of the loop actually ties into policy and ties into decision making, and actually things happen as a result of these processes. But it also means that the motivations for bringing in participatory processes or other forms of digital democracy can be a little bit corrupted in some cases, and that can flow out to the ways in which those practices and processes are implemented, and the sort of results they deliver, and the authenticity with which they approach the entire situation. So I'd say that's another issue as well. But the thing to make me optimistic is the possibilities around scaling participation processes, and addressing particular long horizon issues and new forms of democracy, such as liquid voting and things like that. So yeah, that's what has motivated me to do what I'm doing. Sorry for going a bit over time.
Wonderful. Thanks, Daniel. And I think I often feel it is important to try and find positive aspects, even in sometimes the most somber of conversations. But thank you for that. Thanks to all three of our panelists for some really important insights. So now, opening up the session, opening up the platform. Before we open up to all our participants, this section is really just an opportunity for each of our panelists to react to what they've heard from one another. So I'd like to invite each of you, to each of the panelists, to put your cameras on and put your audio back on, and join me on the platform again, and just to share what thoughts, what reflections and questions you have emanating from what you've heard from one another. So do our fastest fingers first. We'll hear from you, like if you've got questions for the other two panelists.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. Again, I'm so happy to be on the panel with both of you. I'd say, Onwabeze, one of your comments, you mentioned this idea of the digital oligarchy, and I'd really love to hear more insights on that front. You know, as I mentioned, one of the issues that I see is with the way that monopoly means that we have fewer choices and options when it comes to the platforms that we use. So I'd really love to hear more from your perspective and the work that you do in this idea of digital oligarchy and how you see it playing out.
Oh, okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Isedwa. I mean, we sometimes last year commissioned a report on digital oligarchs and the influence on democratic and political processes. We finalized the report sometimes early this year is undergoing, final touches and should be published very soon. But the core of our interest was looking at not only monopoly. I mean, again, we had case studies, Meta, Google, Amazon, and all of that. We were not only looking at the monopoly of these digital platforms or of these technology giants, some quotes. We were looking at how this monopoly has translated from a monopoly of markets to very strong political interference in democratic processes. Associated with this, we also released a report recently around deepfakes and elections, and we have seen how political actors in different countries are utilizing these platforms, utilizing high-ranking officials from these platforms to manipulate conversations, to foster extreme ideas, and to also provide support to particular political actors who are in their interest for whatever reasons. And this seems to be sort of a growing concern. We do not think at the moment, especially with the information and the data available to us, that this is a concern that is residing. We think that this is a concern that would increase over time, and which, of course, prompted us to begin to look at digital sovereignty issues and tech alternative issues, alternative platform issues. And we have also recently also commissioned the work around that to ensure that we either to ensure two things. First, that if we are not able to control these oligarchs, we are able to create alternatives, that reduces drastically the ability of these oligarchs to control political processes and influence democratic outcomes. So this has been our focus for a while, moving from a study to understand on understanding the context of digital oligarchy, platform control, to the effects in political processes and democratic outcomes, and of course, considerations around tech alternatives or platform alternatives that can whittle down the very strong powers that this oligarch will.
Thanks, Chibuzo. Daniel, did you have any questions?
Yes, I did. This question of private companies increasingly be involved in these things is obviously a really, really major one, and both of you have addressed that. We also know that AI is the big elephant in the room, particularly with regards to scaling processes and making a lot of these things more accessible for larger political bodies. So my question is to both of you: what is your general view, first of all, on the implementation of AI in these democratic processes? Is there a line that you draw somewhere? Like, and I'm interested in a general overview of your take on the implementation of AI and whether you think there is such a thing as an ethical implementation.
Yeah, I can start off on that, and I'll borrow some lines from my colleague who leads our work on AI, that there's a spectrum, right? And all we seem to hear, particularly from the private sector, is that AI is either the thing that will destroy the world or that will save the world. And therefore, for that reason, a certain subsect of people or of actors should be in charge of managing our response as a society to AI. I think the reality lies somewhere in the middle. We have seen in the last few years, and even longer, the real impacts of AI tools, and particularly of generative AI tools. But at the same time, these tools are not like a magical thing that all of a sudden changes what existed. I think the very, honestly, kind of boring, straightforward things that we already have are things that we should apply when it comes to governance of AI. So I'm talking about the regulation on privacy, on free expression. Those are the sort of things that I think we need to apply when we're talking about how AI is used and being developed. Because we have a push for things like ethical AI frameworks. I see that a lot from the private sector, that each company has its own set of principles of ethical AI principles. But we have international human rights principles that already apply. And I think sometimes this focus on ethics and ethical AI can be to the detriment of actual strong tools that we have of accountability, of understanding how technologies, any technologies, and including AI, should have an impact on people. So I think it's like a lot of mix of alarmists, but also real issues and harms that we're already seeing, and then very practical places where we can already draw a line and say, no, we do not want AI tools to be used in the circumstances. One of the examples that I think I gave a bit earlier was on the AI tools that are being used for target generation in conflict zones. I mean, the idea that we're allowing a company that provides like email and things that are innocuous in other ways to also provide governments with the ability to choose targets in a military context is something that's concerning. So I think that we have instruments, standards, frameworks that we can apply. The problem with AI, of course, and technology in general, is the speed at which these things keep getting developed and the amount of investment that's been poured by both the private sector and government actors in AI means that there's a lot that they want to get out of it, to get your return on investment.
Thanks, Sisadua. I'm just noting Eastern Elders hand up, but if you're also keen to put in the chat, but yeah, we'll get to our last session in today's discussion. Very excited to see the eagerness in our chat. Chibuzo, over to you
yes.
with your questions to our panel. Yeah.
No. Thank you so much, Zokiswa, and thank you, Daniel and Isidro, for your fantastic contributions. I was just going to mention or to ask whether the emerging concept of digital fatigue is something that we should be very look out for and begin to have very strong conversations around, or whether it's something that that would pass, with the evolution, technological evolution that we are witnessing at the moment. And I'm asking this because, within the context, a whole lot of things seem to be happening at the same time. Especially with the introduction of AI and whole conversations around AI and AI governance and AI regulation and different AI capacities being introduced. And it seems like ordinary citizens are struggling to catch up with technologists and developers and all of that. And whether this is really something that warrants civil society's interest and attention, or it's just something that would pass over time.
Is that a bit of a hot potato, Daniel Isidua? Or who's keen to tackle that?
Well, I don't know if I can. So it's just really it occurs to me while we're talking about this that not to avoid answering the question, but it strikes me that democracy itself has never been more of a technocratic problem. Like the actual functioning of democracy has always had elements of like that alienate the general public, right? Like in terms of processes and systems and how it operates, right? There's always been that challenge of how to familiarize people with the intricacies of it. But this tech dimension to it has again kicked that into overdrive where you've got so many and again that really is the point that I want to make about or in answer to the question is that um, the private sector and this technocratic space is really because it's inserting itself into democratic systems in so many ways the whole topic of democracy becomes that much more alienating to the general public, and we risk um, turning people away from actually understanding how it works and putting up more barriers than there has ever been before. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there is a perfect solution to that that springs to mind, but it's certainly yeah, certainly a problem.
Yeah, I think it is, you know, there is complexities there for sure. Thanks for that. So now I think I'm excited to open up the floor. Thank you so much to our panelists, both for the inputs and the conversation. I imagine for both, I mean, if anyone else listening was as stimulated by that, I wouldn't be surprised, but I found that very interesting. So with assistance from our colleague Daria, we're going to try and navigate as many of the questions we've got in the chat. Just to say, if you, I do note again, we've got a participant who's got their hand up. If you aren't able to put a question in the chat, I wonder if you could try and contact Daria just to see if she can assist, just because we don't have the functionality to have our participants' video and audio on. So just to let you know from that angle, but let's see what's possible. Right. So we had some input and we'll really do our best to make sure we cover it all. Lena was quite curious to engage on the opportunities for powerful civil society organizations. Powerful is an interesting word. To come to a posture about regulation, which can hold big tech accountable. I think we've touched on that a bit, but let's do the fastest hand first. Who would like to sort of cover that? Lena's reflection on that element around holding big tech accountable. I suspect it might be Isadua, given your background and work to date.
Yeah, sorry, let me look at this comments very quickly. Yes, so yeah, thanks for your comments, Lena. The balance between fighting government's overreach while still encouraging important regulatory measures to hold companies accountable, I think is one that is so tricky to maintain. And thank you for the resources that you shared in the chat. Frankly, particularly with the multinational companies, it feels like it's a pick and choose, depending on where in the world you are, kind of approach. Because what we do see that on one hand, there are places where the work is more focused on fighting government overreach, although some of those places are becoming less of the usual suspects and more of the unusual suspects that you would think of governments that are doing a government overreach. But then there are still, yes, important regulation in places around the world that are meant to hold these companies accountable. But to the points that one was made earlier, we unfortunately do still see that in those processes, the private sector has a lot of lobbying power, right, in trying to influence the way that this regulation that's meant to hold them accountable actually plays out. AI, of course, being one of them. But for me, one of the most frustrating things is that even the companies that are more mature, will say, on their roads to human rights respect, and in some places are willing to fight against government overreach, in other places are the ones that are impeding the regulation that's meant to hold them accountable. So this just means that there's an important role for us as civil society in ensuring that we continue to raise the issues of the impact of the private sector in all the spaces that we can, trying to find other stakeholders that we can work with. So for example, in my work, in the last few years, I've been doing more advocacy and engagements with responsible investors. So investors who have a different kind of leverage power than we as civil society do, and equipping them to also be the ones to push for rights, respect, and behavior from companies. And then also just ensuring that when these regulatory measures are being discussed, that we as civil society have input to ensure that that these measures are as holistic as possible. The reality is that some of the more general corporate social responsibility regulation that we see oftentimes can give a pass to tech because they don't have the same kind of impact. So when you're looking at the upstream impacts, for example, of how things are sourced and the supply chain that way, tech generally looks fine, but it's when you look at the downstream impacts of how their tools are being used that you see issues. So I think for us as civil society, the role that we have in ensuring that this kind of regulation is as holistic, that it takes into the accounts the issues that we see in our work, and that there's as much transparency about the influence that the private sector has on lawmaking and legislative processes so that we know exactly where to push back.
Yeah. Thanks, Zdua. I'm also seeing that there is already some conversation in the chat, which I think is also great. Ryan asks, or rather says, in regions where digital infrastructure is increasingly built and controlled by global private companies, gives the example of Amazon, how do we avoid creating new dependencies that could limit democratic participation? I think you've touched on that a bit, but keen as well if there's any sort of new insights on that element or new inputs on that.
So I think there are three things here. First is we need to build the alternatives, right? The alternatives need to be built and they need to exist. Secondly, the alternatives need to also offer unique value. It's just like when the whole encryption conversation was happening between WhatsApp and Signal. And you recall the sort of traction that Signal currently has. It's not the same traction that it had 5-6 years ago, right? When the value was still being propositioned. So you offer the unique value, especially values that align with the values that civil society holds there, rights respecting values, platforms that deviate, that have participatory management frameworks, participatory ownership frameworks, frameworks for resolving grievances, frameworks that guarantee safety for users and also the data of users, frameworks that guarantee and that respects diversity. I mean, there are lots of values, So we offer the unique value, and then you begin to build traction, right? And then in building traction also possibly is preceded by building consensus. Building consensus possibly preceded by collaboration, partnership, and visibility for what has been built, and ownership and input, because the vast majority of individuals, of actors, of organizations need to agree that this is the new alternative and that we need, to move. I just need to be clear on one fact, that building consensus would not be easy, right? That even when platforms offer very unique values and especially values that align with the values that civil society holds dearly, building consensus even within civil society itself is going to be difficult. If you look at, for instance, the ability of civil society, for instance, to build consensus on what platforms we use for communication, for data storage, the whole conversations on whether we should do Microsoft or whether we should do Google or whether we should use other civil society friendly frameworks has not been easy, and that consensus, is yet to be built. Resulting in most actors or organizations using the traditional platforms that are owned by the oligarchs that we are discussing about. So building, just re-emphasizing the point that building consensus will not be easy, but it needs to be done. In the case where civil society actors or ordinary citizens are unable, to limit the powers and the reach of the oligarchs that we are discussing, especially within the context of their control of political processes and political outcomes. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. I do suspect that we won't get to all our participants' questions, but I will, on behalf of our panelists, without consulting with them, I'll do it anyway. So that if there are any questions we aren't able to cover, and if you'd still like to interact, please do share them, and we'll try to answer them even after the sessions. I've done that on behalf of the panelists after their consultation. I think the next question was from Neil, who asked, what does the panel think would unlock collective action in the digital realm? For instance, for us to withdraw our consent to be commercialized in this way and migrate to more rights-respecting platforms. That sounds like a Danielish question, maybe, but open to the panel, of course.
Well, I can certainly have a crack at it. Blair, I think there's two kinds of action that we need to unlock. There is action with respect to the challenges of like corporate oligarchy and the implementation of platforms that are largely controlled by, or the dependencies, I should say, on platforms that are largely controlled by corporates in the private sector. And then there is political participation more generally. And I think one of the things, I mean, this touches on one of the things that I'm most optimistic about digital democracy, actually. And it also touches on AI, because I do think there are a lot of challenges around the use of AI and certainly ethical considerations around the use of AI. And they've all been touched on by the other panelists. But one of the things that I'm most optimistic about is the ability to use AI tools together with consensually provided data, and not just vats of data, and citizen responses, participatory responses, to form consensus and to help the consensus formation process, which I think, Weza, you touched on it, that's a vital component to anything we do here, is being able to build consensus. And it's also one of the biggest things that's been undermined over the last 10 years of the digital environment, right, with respect to not just democratic problems, but problems in general. One of the ways I think we can do that, and one of the ways I think we can stimulate more political participation in an age where it is evaporating in a lot of places, is by taking so many of these issues, whether they're long horizon issues, technocratic issues that alienate people and make them feel like they don't have anything to say, or it's just so frustrating they don't have anything to do with it, or it's so entrenched in existing power structures that it's impossible to budge, and ask long horizon questions. So there's this practice called backcasting, where you don't start with the challenges of the present, you actually start with dreams of the future. What do you want the future to look like? And then you work backwards from that to the present. And that's something that, as I said, although there are a lot of problems with the implementation of these technologies, it's something that in particular, the pairing of participatory processes with AI tools for scaling inputs is kind of perfectly paired to do, right? Perfectly set up to do. And it's also incredibly valuable. It's also something that's missing from the political process writ large, right? We don't paint visions for the future so much anymore. And those visions don't just, they aren't just a beautiful thing to look at. They actually represent context for present day political decisions, the minutiae of policy every day. And they also represent, a kind of, I mean, there was something I learned a long time ago, actually, during the Arab Spring revolutions, that it's seemingly much easier to form consensus around the future than it is around the present. Much easier to form consensus around what you're after than it is how you get there. And we should embrace that. We need to embrace that. So I think one of the things we can do, which I'm quite optimistic about, that helps us build consensus, that helps us challenge some of these structures, and that helps us kind of potentially provide a kind of an accountability layer, is leverage these technologies to start building a vision for the future that we can all kind of nod in general agreement on, and then work backwards from that to present day policy solutions. Use it as a starting point.
Thanks, Daniel. So I'm not being a particularly great facilitator, but it's in part because our panel is really just an amazing panel and really enjoying your insights. I'm going to, I think, really have one more question posed to our panel before we close, and also just encouraging everyone to have a look in the chat. There's also quite interesting to see some of the opportunities, some of the conferences, some of the opportunities we can meet around these topics. There's RightsCon and other conferences and avenues. But I'm going to end, or rather the last question will be, how do you think the gap between traditional civic participation and online activity can be reconciled between younger and older generations to encourage and cultivate a more holistic democratic process? And here I'll ask whoever takes this question to be as brief as they can and speak as fast as I do. No, I'm not sure who's keen to do that. So intergenerational gaps around civic participation and looking at holistic democratic processes. Who's keen for that before we close? That's from Evan Meadows.
In 30 seconds, I would say build digital technologies that are not complicated, that are easy to use, that can exist in the middle between what the older generation can find accessible, easy to use, easy to master, and what, of course, the younger generation, could also easily use. If you build really very complicated digital solutions and digital tools, you risk pushing out a generation, right? A generation, especially in the global majority, that is not very tech savvy, that is not very familiar, with complex technologies and complex interfaces, etc. To build something easy to use that ensures that participation is easily cross-cutting.
Thanks, Teresa. Well done. That was exactly on point. Thank you so much. So I really have found our conversation today very enlightening and quite stimulating. I think there's a lot in the chat. I'd like to first just thank everyone who did participate. For those of us who observed the Easter break, I think it's fantastic to have people here, essentially the equivalent of a Friday afternoon, just before the Easter break, joining, and I think for a really stimulating session. Thank you for the inputs in the chat. We're also going to save those. Those are quite valuable. Thank you for the reflections and observations and the dialogue that's also happening there. I want to take a special moment just to really acknowledge our contributions from the panel. I think in closing, aside from acknowledging our panel and our participation more widely on behalf of the ICSE and the CTIN, really just want to say that this discussion has illuminated many of the issues. I think on the one hand, some of what is contributing to a crisis or crises in the context of digital, but on the other hand, some illuminating some really significant opportunities and opportunities for advocacy, for holding the private sector and the public sector to account, but also highlighting responsibilities and roles that the civil society context has. We've also seen some resources shared in the chat. Thank you for that to our panelists, and thank you to others who shared that, and we will download those and make sure that we've got them on record. Aside from that, just want to say, wishing everyone well and hope to see you at our next digital dialogue. If you haven't already signed up for our newsletter or our updates, please do so. Otherwise, Isidua, Daniel, Chibuzo, and to the entire team and all our panelists and participants, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I did. Thank you.
So